Hello, Heather. How are you today? I'm so excited for this conversation.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm great. Thanks. How are you?
I'm doing great. Now, you're in Ontario,
I
correct?
am. Yes, that's right.
Nice. I'm in the DC metro area, so we're on the same
Not too
coast.
far. I
No,
used to,
no, not on
I
the
used,
same coast. What am I saying?
yeah.
I shouldn't speak geography because I'm geographically challenged. So,
I actually did some work in Washington when I was writing my book, so I've been there a couple of times in the past few
oh,
years, pre-pandemic, of course. But yeah, it's such
right.
a fun place to go.
It is. It's very different today. Most people that live around here do not go into town ever since everything that took
Of,
place.
of course, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. All right. So I don't even know where to start because I'm looking at your bio, and let's start with how I usually do, which is, tell me about your story as much as you want to divulge, and how you got to where you are today.
Well, I guess my story is a little multifaceted, as most people's are. So I'm actually from the east coast of Canada. I'm from the Atlantic provinces. So Nova Scotia and Maine actually have a ferry that connects the two, and so I'm from Nova Scotia. So that's where
Oh,
I
wow.
originally came from, and my family is still there. But I started my working career as a teacher. I was a high school teacher for 11 years, and I taught French and history courses, and I actually taught in post-secondary and did some government teaching as well. But yeah, I in that time I was also finding my way through a pretty toxic relationship in the beginning parts of my career, and that was really challenging, and it was one of the big motivators for moving into the work that I'm now doing, as being a survivor myself of an abusive relationship. And when that relationship ended, I actually decided that I needed to get a lot of distance and just get away and have a complete change from everything. So I took a leave of absence from my work, and I moved to a developing country for 2 years.
Oh, wow. Which country
Yeah,
was that?
I moved to the Dominican Republic,
Oh,
and
okay.
most people are like,
Nice.
"Oh, that sounds fabulous with the beaches and everything," and
Oh,
that
no, it's very different.
yeah, the tourist areas are absolutely fabulous. That's true. But yeah, I was not living in those areas. I was more inland and in rural area. Um, and that was a very interesting and humbling and life-changing time for me. And then I came back to Canada and went back to school to do my master's in psychology. And yeah, my work kind of evolved from doing child and family therapy based work, and then more focused on helping other survivors, and my background and training is in trauma, a trauma assessment and treatment of PTSD. And so a lot of my work has sort of naturally morphed into working with other survivors. And so those are the sort of big driving factors behind the two books that I've written as well. And so, yeah, it's been an interesting journey. Of course, along the way, lots of other things have happened, but my my desire for changing and moving into psychology and therapy work really started when I was teaching, because I taught in a very underprivileged areas with a lot of with students who were showing up with massive, massive complex trauma situations from their homes,
Oh, my goodness.
and
That must be so difficult to, yeah.
and like we were just not equipped to deal with those things, and so I couldn't help but
No.
feel just so incredibly paralyzed in like how I was feeling them and not being able to help them. Meanwhile, we're like expecting them to show up and sit down and be quiet and learn things and do the work. And they don't know where their next meal is coming, or their brother's in jail, or someone just got shot, or, all of these terribly traumatic things are happening to them, outside of school. And
Right.
and so that was a big motivator for me to be like, you know what, I really would prefer to be able to know how to help people deal with those things so that
Yeah.
they can be successful when they show up at school. Right. So that was my initial motivator for changing into the work that I do now.
I love that. And now, are you able to do anything with any of the education system to help with them? Or
Yeah, so organizationally, again, kind of, especially in this post-pandemic kind of place that we're starting to navigate, it's really important for organizations to understand, the complexities of trauma, and how quite often we have these students and often staff members who are showing up each day who are actively going through something, or who are survivors of something, or who have some unresolved traumatic experiences that are negatively impacting them still. And how do we create an environment that is conducive and inclusive and safe for individuals who are among us each day, right? To feel like they are in a safe space, so that they don't feel like they might be triggered or re-traumatized by something that happens.
Yeah, and where you were teaching, I mean, those are really big deals that most kids don't have to deal with things like that.
Yes,
Unfortunately, we have too many that do. Even if it's just they don't know where their next meal is coming from. I mean, it's heartbreaking.
And I mean, if we look at the most recent case of what happened in the United States, there, like the survivors of that most recent attack, all of those students have to go back to school now. How could that possibly feel safe, right? And so we look at those things. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And so I said to Heather before we started recording, I was like, boy, we have a lot in common. So I'm a PTSD survivor myself. And when you were talking about that, it was something that I never really thought about too much, of how when I had my experience when I was 12 years old, until you brought it up, I never really thought about how not one person in the school said anything to me.
No,
nothing.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And I had just, my brother had tragically died while serving in the U.S. Army, and everybody knew about it, but not one person said anything to me. So what does that tell a child? It didn't
It's not
happen.
important.
It's not important. It's no big deal. Right?
Move on.
Smile and everything will be okay.
Exactly. And this is kind of these are like larger systemic issues, and it's not only in the school system where these things are problems. If we look at law enforcement as well, we look at the legal system, all of these large, systems that we have built really need to be revamped into this more like trauma-informed, like anti-oppressive sort of framework that most people don't even have an awareness of, right? And like you said, you went to school, everybody knew that you had this traumatic loss, and nobody said anything to you about it, right? And so that is a really, really devastating message as a child for you to receive.
Yeah, and I mean, it was 1978. People didn't go to therapy. They didn't.
Of course.
But there was just nothing. And you know what? It's kind of like, it's not something that I harbor on, or that's in the back of it, that they didn't do anything. It was just, I always use the example. There was one day I was on my bike, and I was a few years after my brother's death, and my girlfriend and I were riding our bikes home from cheerleading practice, and there was this car parked on the side of the road, and I'm riding my bike past him, and I look in, and there's a man sitting in the car naked, and he was, playing with himself, put it nicely.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my gosh. And I told my friend, and we raced home, and I said, Mom, and I told her, I was like, no. And she goes, oh, that didn't happen. And I go, okay. And I just forgot about it, right? Nowadays, the police would have been called. The child would be put in therapy. So which is right? Like, because in my mind, I was like, oh, okay. Like, and I never thought twice about it.
Yeah. But and so we talk about ACEs, or like these adverse childhood experiences, and some of them are more impactful and some of them are not really noteworthy or mentionable, right?
Right.
And it just depends on each person's past experience, their family dynamics, their exposure to such things in the past, whatever, as to how impactful any of these events are going to be. But, it's impossible to reach adulthood without having experienced some kind of trauma in your life, right?
And like for me, it didn't I was like, it didn't bother me. I was like, oh my God, look what I saw. I was like, like, it wasn't like, oh my God. Like I wasn't traumatized from it. So, so I guess
who might have seen it, who maybe had an experience with a man at their home that could be really, really, really horrific for them.
Exactly.
Right? So it really just depends. Right. And so, what is innocuous and like a point of gossip for someone could be this like devastating, traumatizing situation for someone else, right? And it could be something as small as, breaking a glass or slamming a cupboard door.
Right.
For someone, that's nothing. For someone else, it brings them back to a time when they were attacked, right? Mm-hmm.
So here, this was my first live therapy session with Heather Kent. Just walk me through that little moment. And now it just reinforces that it's okay.
Yeah.
It is Absolutely. What it is.
Yeah.
So thank you.
It was obviously this guy has some stuff that was going on, but in that time, there was not a framework in place to intervene, right? Either.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So that was our PTSD conversation. Is there anything else you want to touch on with that? Because I want to talk about your books.
Oh, no, I mean, just basically, having an awareness that we're always surrounded by people who maybe have gone through something. And so when we have interactions with people, to be mindful and to be kind and to remember that we never understand what another person has been through.
Oh, thank you for saying that, because we don't know what we don't know.
That's right.
And while that person may not react in a way that you thought they should have, sometimes we have to give people grace.
That's right. And understanding. Seek to understand, what led to that? Like, what happened to you? Are you okay?
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Is everything okay? Can I, did I just trigger something that I said or what? But yes, I'm glad you said that, because it's so important to remember. Okay. So you've got 2 books.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yes. So let's talk about the first one. Heal from Your Narcissistic Ex.
That's right. Yes. So
I love the title.
Well, I'm glad. And honestly, it was one of my clients who inspired me. She actually said, she's like, you should write a book about this specifically, because it would be so helpful. And I had more and more clients showing up in my practice who were struggling and suffering the effects of these relationships with people who were suffering from narcissistic tendencies. And myself, I went through it as well. And so this was the nature of the abuse that I sustained as well. And so, and I also really feel like we are kind of living in this era of narcissism right now. And a lot of people, and it's a big buzzword, of course, but to understand, like, there are specific, like, this is a clinical problem that does have specific diagnostic criteria. And if you kind of look at those traits, you can really quickly assess whether or not you're in a relationship with someone, whether that be like an intimate relationship or a familial relationship or a work professional relationship. And these relationships, these toxic relationships with narcissistic people exist everywhere. And so having an understanding of what that looks like and how that abuse kind of manifests is really helpful, because a lot of the time the manipulation and the way the tactics that are used make a person feel as though they're going crazy, and that they have, are not understanding what's happening, or they're second guessing themselves and questioning their sense of reality and all of those things. And so it really is destabilizing and hard to understand what's happening when you are in a relationship with someone like this.
So can you explain what you mean by a narcissist? Can you just dive into that? Because there's narcissistic behavior, and then there's being a narcissist.
So the diagnostic criteria, if we're looking at like the DSM-5 from the American Psychological Association. I actually don't love that that criteria, because it's very specific to only one subtype of narcissistic personality, which is the more grandiose or like overt, in your face kind of subtype. You might be able to recall well-known figures that you might have seen on TV when you kind of look at these traits. And so they have this really exaggerated sense of self, and they love to be in the spotlight. They love to draw attention to themselves. They want to be in large crowds. They talk about how they're amazing, how amazing they are. They talk about all their accomplishments, whether they're true or not. They talk about all of the fantastic things that they've done and how much people love them, and this type of thing. And they have this sense that they are entitled, that they are special, and that they can only interact with other, similarly special people, like high profile people such as themselves. They also are extremely aggressive in terms of like expecting people to do what they want and do what they say, and being complacent and not arguing with them and not questioning them or challenging them. They expect people to be jealous of them. They want people to be envious of them. Outer appearances are, of course, extremely important. They also do lots of comparing to others and want to make sure that they're, the best of the best, and having the biggest, and this, that, and the other. And then we have the hallmark of a narcissistic personality is the inability to experience empathy. So this lack of empathy for others, this inability to think about how other people feel, how their behavior can impact someone else, even if they're told how that can impact someone else, they don't care. Like, it just isn't a factor. The means always justify, like the ends always justify the means. It doesn't matter how they get there. And they're only going to do something if there's something in it for them.
That sounds like a key point right there.
So, but the it's the empathy part too. Like, it doesn't matter
the empathy.
How someone else feels. It doesn't matter what someone else is going through. It doesn't matter what they're doing. It doesn't matter if how they're doing is negatively impacting someone else. None of that matters. And the other big piece is the inability to take responsibility, a lack of accountability for their own actions. Right. Blaming other people, creating stories where they're the victim, and they use a lot of gaslighting behaviors, and that's kind of where they're like projecting and blaming and saying that the other person caused them to have to abuse them in this way, and it's the other person's fault, or they'll just deny that it happened whatsoever, or deny that they said that, deny that they did that. And so these are the types of things that are really common traits.
And what type of long-term effect does that have on the person on the other side of it?
So what a lot of people don't realize is that when you are constantly experiencing this like instability, this walking on eggshells, this hypervigilance, and you're trying to figure out what kind of mood are they going to be in, and how can I mitigate that, and what could possibly set them off, and how do we have this feeling that we have to fix their happiness, their mood is our responsibility, and it just becomes extremely exhausting, and you never know kind of what you're going to. It's a little bit like emotional Russian roulette on any given day or any given moment. You never know kind of what's going to happen with that person, and the results of this in terms of long-term effects is that it actually has chemical and physiological changes on your brain.
Really?
So prolonged exposure to destabilizing and unsafe situations, traumatic events, they cause changes in different parts of the brain. So the part of the brain that's responsible for memory, for organization, putting things into logical order and sequence, that kind of thing, that part of your brain physically shrinks over time. It gets smaller. And so a lot of people who are survivors or have been in these types of emotionally abusive relationships, which may or may not accompany physical violence, abusive relationships do not constitute physical violence necessarily.
Right.
It's
Exactly.
really important to know that. And the long-term effects and the damage that emotional abuse has on a person is far more devastating than cuts and bruises. They heal much more quickly. So, this part of your brain is has shrunk out over time. And so they complain about how they can't remember anything. It's really hard to remember. Or like, try to do like a timeline with them of their life, and they can't remember the order when things happen, or there's complete periods of time that they can't recall at all. And it's because this part of the brain has been impacted by the trauma.
Wow. That's pretty serious.
Yeah. And then the lower brainstem, kind of more primal part that is also significantly changed, is called the amygdala. And the amygdala is that danger meter alarm system that goes off when we sense that we're in danger and we have to like deal with it. So that part of our brain that sets the alarm off, danger, 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 run away, fight, or like freeze, that part grows. It gets bigger. So you have this hyperactive alarm system firing all the time, thinking that you're constantly in danger, but you're not able to escape because you live in the dangerous situation. And so it's firing these stress hormones all the time, and it is just extremely destabilizing. You're constantly on edge. You can't sleep. It's difficult to eat. Concentration, of course, is affected. And yeah, so you're just constantly on edge and super aware, hyper alert, hyper vigilant.
Wow.
As a result of that.
Wow. And so by working with a trauma specialist such as yourself, that can help to manage it.
Well,
right?
and the brain is not, the brain is malleable, which is the good news, because so the brain
Right.
can heal. These things can kind of restabilize and go back to the way that they used to be. And so, yeah, absolutely. We work on understanding what has happened, why it's so difficult, and why emotions are so hard, and why these things are going on. And then we work on the symptoms, and we work on strategies to alleviate those symptoms, minimize them, and hopefully fully eradicate them over time. But we cannot heal our brain if we are still in that situation that is causing the harm.
Right. You can't possibly.
No.
You have to remove yourself. Yes.
That's right.
Yes. Which is a good segue into your next book. I left my toxic relationship. Now what?
And so actually that was the first one that I wrote, and it's more general.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a more general kind of guide to once you've left, there's all kinds of stuff that's going on. It's very scary to end a toxic relationship, because you don't know what the repercussions are going to be, how they're going to punish you, what's going to happen, how they can still come at you. And like, it's very, very scary. And there's all these things to consider. And we might even talk ourselves back into going back, because the alternative just seems too difficult and too impossible and just insurmountable. So there's a lot of those things to work through. And then we look at, again, of course, the healing from the trauma. We look at the PTSD symptoms, because most people don't realize that they have PTSD.
Nope.
And so we look at those symptoms. We look at how we can minimize those and increase this feeling of safety, because it's all about safety. So, food, water, shelter, safety. Like, safety is one of the, and if you look at the hierarchy of needs in the Maslow's pyramid, safety is on the bottom. Like, it's the main, it's down there with food, water. And so we need to create this feeling of safety above all else, so that we can improve our daily functioning. Yes.
Yes. So important. And I'm so glad that you went above and beyond what I thought you would with some of your explanations. So thank you so much. I want to add, though, just for those of you out there who don't fully understand PTSD, one of the misconceptions that I had about it, and now granted, my therapist, because this was many years ago when I was in therapy, never labeled me as PTSD. And they never, I was not given that label. And I don't know that I would have accepted it, because it was my understanding at that time, and this was in the 90s, think that PTSD, that's for war veterans,
Oh, yeah.
POW camp, folks
Very
coming
common
back from,
misconception.
yeah. And it was like, so then I was like, well, I've got a little bit of PTSD, like I wouldn't, and now I really understand it. And I'm like, wow, because whatever trauma you experienced, you own that. That's your trauma. And you can't compare it to somebody else's trauma. It's
That's
not
right.
like your trauma's, my trauma's worse than your trauma. Like there's
So
no
you shouldn't
comparing
have
it.
PTSD because it wasn't as bad. Yeah.
No, right,
That's not how
exactly.
it works.
There's none of that, because that's kind of where my brain would go. It's like, oh, it's not that bad. It was just kind of. But well, no, it is. It's real. I know how to. The good news is I know how to deal with it. I know how to talk myself off the ledge when I have an episode. And as a matter of fact, third time today, I'm talking about this. Last week when I was watching the French Open, which I'm obsessed with tennis. And so I'm like, in the middle of working, I run out to check the score, and I'm sitting there, and out of the blue, the way my PTSD shows up is that it used to be my ex-husband. Now it's my son, that because my brother died, I'm worried that my son, like something awful is going to happen to him.
Right.
And I'm just sitting there watching the French Open. I don't know if something was said. I don't know what triggered it, but it was almost paralyzing.
Overwhelming feeling. Yeah.
This overwhelming feeling of, oh my God, something horrible is going to happen to him. And it left me feeling paralyzed for about a minute. And I felt it, and I have my own way, a lot of deep breathing, and I have my own way of dealing with it. And I was able to calm myself down. So within 3 minutes, it was completely gone. So that's the good news about PTSD, is that you can learn to manage it. And it doesn't come up that often anymore. I mean,
it's
my
less
brother
and less
died.
frequent. It's less and less frequent. And that's the thing, like, it's not, we can't erase the things that happened to us, and no therapist can cure your trauma, but we learn how to understand what's happening to us when these things do come up, when these reminders kind of bring us into this space of like, oh gosh, this feels scary, right? Yeah. And then we're like, oh, okay, is this really scary, or am I just having a moment? And then we can work with those strategies on how to bring ourselves back to now, back to what's real, back to the present, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah. This has been such a great conversation and such an important one. Heather, thank you so, so much for joining me today. Is there anything else that you'd like to say before we finish up?
Well, for anyone who might be interested, I do have both of my books available for free to download from my website, actually. So if folks are wanting to get more information or wanting to have a look at those resources, if any of this is resonating, then they can certainly download it from my website, which is just heatherjkent.com, which is my name. So they can go over to that, and they can also book a consultation time with me if they would like to connect.
Perfect. And I will have all of that information in the show notes as well.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And remember that we are not alone in this journey, and there are other people who are available and who are wanting to help you as you navigate through. So thank you so much for having me and for allowing us to talk about this, as it is really important. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you, Heather. Take care.